All right, hey, good morning. Not too long ago, I was in line in Orange County, Southern California, where I live, because one of the new versions of the iPhone came out. And I had to have it. It came out on a Friday. Saturday, I was in line. I got there about 11 or 12 in the morning, left at 4 o'clock with my phone. So I was standing in line at least 4 hours. The line went out of the store and down about 3 or 4 stores, and I'm just standing there waiting for hours. These 3 high school students come walking up to the guy right next to me in line. They said, "Hey, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" The guy doesn't say a single word. He turns around, leans on the railing, and totally ignores these students. So they start to walk away a little embarrassed. I said, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" They said, "Well, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" I said, "I'm not even sure if he existed. Do you really believe that Christian stuff?" You know where this is going, right? The guy looks at me and says, "Well, of course we do. Jesus is the Son of God, and he died on the cross for your sins. You need to believe in him to go to heaven." He starts preaching the gospel to me. And I looked at him, I said, "Why should I believe that story?" And he holds up his Bible. He says, "Because it's right here in the Bible, which is the Word of God." I said, "Well, how do you know that book is actually true?" He said, "If you point to 2 Timothy chapter 3, it tells us that all Scripture is inspired." Is that a good argument? If you want to know if the Bible's true, can you turn to a passage within the Bible, assuming it's true, to prove that it's true? That's called circular reasoning. I said, "Is there any evidence that actually tells us this book is true from outside?" He said, "Yes. Don't you know? There's these tens of thousands of ancient manuscripts that completely match up and tell us we have the Bible exactly it was written down." At this point, I looked at him, I said, "Do you know how many words are in the original Greek New Testament?" And at this point, I know exactly what he was thinking. Why did I have to talk to this guy? He said, "I have no idea." I said, "About 136,000 words. Then I pointed out to him that between those different manuscripts, there's about 300,000 to 400,000 differences. I looked at him, I said, "That means every word in the Bible, there's 2 or 3 other words that could have been there. Can you explain that to me?" He goes, "What do you think about evolution?" I said, "I'm glad you asked. The evidence for evolution is overwhelming. Don't you know we have vestigial structures in our back left over from our ancestors with tails? Don't you know humans and chimps share 99.5% DNA? Haven't you seen an embryological development?" I'm going on, and he's just backing up, going like this, and his eyes are getting bigger. All of a sudden, I stopped. I said, "I got a confession to make. I'm a Christian." And I wish you could have seen his face and his response. He goes like this. He goes, "Oh." And then a girl standing right next to him, she said, "Was all that true?" I said, "Well, some yes, most of it no." I said, "Look, I'm a Christian. Like you, I believe the Bible's true, but the difference between me and you is I know why I think it's actually true." I said, "Like you, I believe in intelligent design, but the difference is I know why I actually believe the world was designed." Then I told him, I said, "Good for you on a Saturday in Southern California, 10 minutes from the beach, being at the mall, sharing your faith on your own time. But don't you think if you're going to go tell people they should believe in Jesus or intelligent design, you should have some good reasons why you know that's actually true?" We agreed. We had a great conversation. They left. 10 minutes later, I'm facing this way. I feel a tap on the shoulder. I turn around, and it's 3 new students who say, "Hey, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" Well, I'm just tired of sitting in line, so I start to launch into my charade again, and so I look over their shoulders, and back a few stores, about as far back as the wall back there, was the original students who set up their friends to go convert the atheist. Now, that's exactly what many of you would have done, right? Now, I'm guessing probably most of you admire them for using their own time in summer to go talk to people about Jesus. But what do you think is going to happen to these students when they get to the university? And in the university, in public and private universities in America, there's between 2 to 3 times as many atheists as there are in the public as a whole. What's going to happen when they get to university and their professor starts critiquing the Bible? Their professor starts advancing Darwinian evolution and says intelligent design is silly. What's going to happen to them if they don't have a response? Well, you know, don't you? Probably the same thing that happened to a Harvard biologist by the name of E.O. Wilson. E.O. said, quote, "When I was 15, I entered the Southern Baptist Church with great fervor and interest in the fundamental religion. I left at 17 when I got to the University of Alabama and heard about evolutionary theory." Now, by the way, these notes are in your packet, so take out your packet so you can follow along. It's going to be very helpful to write down some of these main points for you. So take out your packets, grab a pen. If you don't have one, take one from your neighbor. Only if your neighbor's a freshman. Partly kidding, I taught freshmen 9 years. Take out your packets so you can follow along here. Shh. Mr. Wilson says he abandoned his faith when he discovered evolutionary theory and realized, I don't need to believe in God, it can happen by itself. Now you might be thinking, what's the big deal? Why not just say God created the world and he used evolution? Why not just believe in evolution and say that's the mechanism by which God created? And the reality is, evolution has become much more than just a scientific theory. Evolution is more than like plate tectonics or gravity. It's actually become an ideology. Evolution has become the basis of a worldview in conflict with Christianity. So Dinesh D'Souza, who used to work in the White House, said, "We have Darwinism, but not Keplerism. We encounter Darwinists, but no one describes himself as an Einsteinian. Darwinism has become an ideology." And I say this to my students. I tell my high school students, I say, look, you're going to be taught to see the whole world through a Darwinian perspective, that everything that exists has evolved through this purposeless, blindless process. And occasionally, my students, believe me, I got an email back from a girl who graduated from a high school. She went to a state school in California. And the email looked exactly like this. She said, "I have also been inundated with evolutionary theory. Oh my gosh, it's everywhere. Caps, exclamation point, smiley face. My psychology class, my biology class," she went on and on about how once she was in the university, she was taught evolutionary theory in all of her different classes. Now, it seems to me that it makes sense you'd learn evolutionary theory in biology class, but why history? Why psychology? Why sociology? It's because evolution has become an ideology. You see, there's a well-known atheist by the name of Daniel Dennett, aka Santa Claus. He is an outspoken atheist, and he wrote a book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And I disagree with almost everything he wrote, but he made a point in there. I stopped and I said, this guy's right. He said, Darwinism is like a universal acid. Now, how many of you have seen at least one of those Alien or Aliens or the recent Prometheus film? How many of you have seen one of the Alien or Aliens? Okay. What's the blood of the aliens? It's acid, right? Acid does what? It dissolves and eats away everything in its path. It eats away this concrete, it would eat away this wooden stage, it would eat away metal, it eats away people, just not the inside of the aliens because it's a cheesy science fiction movie. But we get the point, right? Acid dissolves everything in its path. He said Darwinism is like a universal acid. What did he mean? He meant that if we have evolved through this blind, purposeless process, then everything we do and everything we believe needs to be understood from a Darwinian perspective. So, for example, there was an article in New York Times a couple years ago. You ready? Here's the title. It was called, "Why We Like Hot Chilies, an Evolutionary Perspective." So if you want to understand why people like hot chilies to burn their mouth, you look to evolution for an answer, because evolution wired us to like hot chilies. In fact, I saw an article that said, "Why Men Prefer Blondes Over Brunettes, an Evolutionary Perspective." I'm not saying whether that's true or false, but if evolution is true, we have to understand everything through that perspective. In fact, that's why we get books like this, Why We Get Sick, the New Science of Darwinian Medicine. So if you want to understand how medicine works, look to Darwin's theory. Or economics as an evolutionary science. If you want to understand our economy, look to evolution. Or law, evolutionary jurisprudence. evolutionary jurisprudence. The law you understand from the perspective of Darwin. You know, I used to tell a lot of jokes about lawyers, but I stopped because they try to sue me. No, I'm just kidding. The other day, I was starting off telling a joke about comparing lawyers to jerks. And this person in the front, about where you are, was just getting mad, going like this as I talked. I thought, oh boy, this has got to be a lawyer. When I was done, this person came right up. He said, I'm offended at your joke, that your story, that you compare lawyers to jerks. I said, well, are you a lawyer? He said, no, I'm a jerk. If Darwin's theory is correct, then we need to even understand the legal profession from the perspective of evolution. Or how about this book, Religion Explained, the Evolutionary Origins of Religious Thought. So why do we believe in God? Evolution has an explanation. How about this one, Literary Darwinism, understanding literature and English from the perspective of evolution. Now, this is not just in academia and in the university. It's actually steeped its way down in popular culture. So how many of you, I'm curious, still watch reruns of the Friends TV show? Have you? Oh my goodness, almost all of you do. Okay. Now, if somebody in evolution is going to doubt, in Friends is going to doubt evolution, which character would it be? It would be Phoebe, that's right. Why? Because Phoebe is the dumb blonde. I'm not saying blondes are dumb. If you haven't noticed, my 6-year-old daughter is blonde. I speak to her very slowly. Now, there's a Friends episode. She didn't get that. That's okay. Because she's blonde. No, I'm just kidding. I'm dead. In a Friends episode, Ross discovers that Phoebe doubts evolution. Here's exactly how the conversation went. It said, excuse me, evolution is not for you to buy, Phoebe. Evolution is scientific fact, like the air we breathe, like gravity. When this show went off the air, 2 or 3 years ago, the producer of Friends said, we admit we used this TV show to push our social, philosophical, and religious agenda on culture. If you don't realize that, you need to get your head out of the sand. If you type in YouTube evolution and Friends, there's about 4 or 5 episodes where this kind of thing comes up, and they're subtly trying to get people to realize if you question evolution, you're an idiot. So here's the question that we're exploring. Are you ready? Here's the most important question that we're going to talk about this morning. Are we accidental byproducts of blind forces in nature? Are you a cosmic accident? Or are we the pinnacle of creation, intended by a personal and a loving God? So have all of us just arrived from this purposeless, random, unguided process? Or are we intentionally placed here by a God who cares about us, has a plan for our life, and knows the number of hairs on our head? That's the question we're asking. And if you realize, every single worldview has to answer this question. You see, every worldview has 3 components. Number 1, the origin. Where did we come from? How did we get here? Every single philosophy of life, every religion has to give an explanation of how we got here. But second, what went wrong? The predicament. Why is the world messed up? And what do you think number 3 is? Resolution, or how we fix it. Exactly, resolution. How do we fix it? Every single worldview has those 3 components. For example, take Buddhism. Buddhism says we've been eternally here going through the cycle of samsara. The problem is we have desires, and desires create suffering. So the solution is to follow the 8-fold path to get rid of our desires. Take what's taught in the largest church in America, which is the Church of Oprah, by the way. Well, you don't think it's a church? Remember what happened to Lance Armstrong recently? How he sinned? He had to go before the high priestess, Oprah Winfrey, and apologize for his sins and get cleared, and then he could go back, right? Well, she teaches what's called New Age, where we've eternally been a part of the character of God. We forgot that we were God, which is the problem, and the solution is we need to remember that we're God. Every worldview does this. Okay, now what's the Christian story? Origin is what? In the beginning, God created, right? This is the Christian story. It starts off with God creating us. What's wrong with the world? Sin, right? We've said, God, forget it. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. And what's the resolution? Okay, look. If you don't know the answer to a question at church camp, just say Jesus. You'll get it right half the time. In fact, in my school, I tell my students, I say, if you don't know the answer to the question, write Jesus and you'll get it right 50% of the time. In fact, earlier this past year in my daughter's class, she's going in first grade, when she was in junior kindergarten is when they teach kids to not blurt out the answer and raise their hand. So the first day of class, the teacher said, I'm going to teach the students how to raise their hand and give an answer. So I'm going to start with something easy. She said, class, what's gray, has a big bushy tail and climbs in trees? And no kid raised their hand. She thought, this is strange. She said, class, raise your hand. I'll call on you and you give me the answer. What's gray, has a big bushy tail and climbs in trees? Nothing. She thought, this is strange. I'll give him one more chance. She said, class, raise your hand and tell me the answer. What's gray, has a big bushy tail and climbs in trees? Finally, in the back, little Johnny raised his hand. The teacher said, yes, Johnny. He said, I'll say Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me. Now, in this case, the answer is Jesus. The Christian story is God created us. We rebelled from God and sinned. The resolution is found in a relationship with God through the death of Jesus Christ. That's the Christian story that we think is true. Now, the evolutionary story, or Darwinism, is very different. You see, the origin, according to Victor Stenger, he says, quote, Darwinism implies that humanity developed by accident. You are an accident. You were not planned. What's the predicament? The predicament is, quote, evil is the result of the clumsy process of evolution. Evolution is not a perfect process. Things get hurt in the middle. What's the resolution? It's not God that's going to solve it. It's we must solve it ourselves, essentially through science. That is a very different worldview than the Christian worldview. What does this actually lead to if you take it seriously? Listen to something that Darwin himself wrote. He realized that if his view is true, what it would conclude with. He said, the view now held by most physicists is that the sun with all the planets will in time grow too cold for life, unless indeed some great body dashes into the sun and gives it fresh life. Believe as I do that man in the distant future will be a far more perfect creature than he is now. Notice he says man will be a far more perfect creature. He doesn't mention women. Why? Women are already perfect. Men are just trying to catch up. Can I get an amen? Then he says, come on, God, we know it's true. There's no point in fighting it. He says, it is an intolerable thought that he and all other sentient beings are doomed to complete annihilation after such long continued slow progress. You see what he's saying? He's saying it's a bummer, evolution is moving forward and we're getting better, but eventually the sun's gonna run out of energy, the planet will be inhospitable to life, and we're all gonna die. That's the Darwinian worldview. The question is, are you a big accident doomed to destruction, or are you made in the image of God and have the possibility of eternal life with him? That's the question we have to ask. Now, I wrote a book on this, some of you picked up yesterday, called Understanding Intelligent Design, with a professor by the name of William Dembski. He used to live right up here in Waco, by the way. And you know what, when I wrote this book, I read all the arguments against intelligent design, all the arguments for intelligent design. I read atheists, Christians, skeptics, you name it. And something amazed me when I was researching for this book. You know what it was? It was how many atheists and Darwinists admit that the world looks as if it was designed by God. Did you know that? Did you know that most people who don't believe God designed the world still say, boy, the world looks as if God designed it? So the most famous atheist in the world, by the name of Richard Dawkins, he says, quote, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Now, I got a question. If something walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, eats like a duck, swims like a duck, and sounds like a duck, what do you think it is? Yeah, cow, of course. There are some freshmen here. Maybe something looks, sounds, walks, and smells like a duck because it is a duck. Maybe the world, to both skeptics and to believers, looks like it was designed because it actually is designed. Now, what we're going to do this morning, we're going to stop, and when we're done, we're going to take questions. I want challenges from you. I want questions of clarification. I want questions of things maybe in your biology textbooks I didn't talk about. When we're done, we're going to pass the mic around, or something yesterday that was brought up that bothered you last night. You're thinking, I didn't get an answer to this. We're going to talk about that, okay? Now, remember yesterday I said the more we learn about science, what happens to room for God? It gets bigger, and there's bigger room. Guess what the result is? The truth is, the more we learn about God, the smaller the gaps become, in a sense. And the truth is, the more we see the fingerprint of a creator, the more we learn about the natural world. The more we learn about the cell and the structure of the universe, the more we see that something David wrote is true. See, David wrote in Psalms 19:1 and 2, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hand. Day by day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. King David wrote 3,000 years ago that since the natural world was made by a creator, the natural world reveals truths about the creator. And we're going to look at three. All right, so we're going to look, I wrote this book, Understand Intelligent Design, and we look at 5 examples. Throw it up there for me. 5 examples, but because of time, we're not going to look at all these. We're going to look at 3 of them. Let's start with physics, okay? Let's start with the world of physics. I want to imagine you come visit me in Southern California. We go walking through the mountains where I live, and we find an abandoned cabin that looks like this. And you go walking up, and you think, ooh, let's explore this cabin. But as you get closer, you notice something really strange. You hear the sound of your favorite song in the background, Beat It by Michael Jackson. So you open up the door, you go walking in, and you smell the scent of your most beloved meal. But then you think, this is strange. You look down and you see shoes that are just your size, a jacket that fits you perfectly. You look on the table, it's all the books you like to read and magazines. You look over the TV, it's the DVDs you like, the video game series. You go over to the fridge, you open it up, it's all the snacks you like to munch on. You walk into the bathroom and it's all the toiletries you use. Now, what would you suspect? Yeah, besides somebody stalking you, you would think, listen very carefully, you would know for sure that this couldn't be coincidence. Somebody had prepared this place in advance for you. Somebody knew that you were coming, knew exactly what you liked and needed to survive, and prepared that place in advance for you. Do you know what scientists have found the past few years? That the universe as a whole is just like this cabin. In fact, a well-known scientist who's not a Christian by the name of Freeman Dyson, he said, as we look into the universe and identify the many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked to our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe, in some sense, must have known that we were coming. What does he mean? You get in the shower in the morning, what do? You take the hot, you take the cold, and you fine-tune it so it's just right. You know what we've discovered just over the past few years? That there's laws of the universe, certain constants in physics, that all have one strange thing in common. They're set exactly where they need to be for there to be life. So think about it this way. If you read the Goldilocks story, right? That's too hot, that's too cold, just right. We live in a universe governed by certain laws, and they all happen to be set just right for life. So think about it. It's like life, the laws of our universe exist on a razor's edge, and the slightest change to the left or right, and the entire universe would be inhospitable to life. That's why Frederick Hoyle, who coined the term Big Bang, Frederick Hoyle said, it almost seems like someone's been monkeying with physics. Paul Davies from Arizona State University, again, not a Christian, but an internationally acclaimed scientist, said, as we look out at the universe, it seems like a put-up job because the laws are so fine-tuned. And then he said, quote, I'll read what he wrote. The cliche that life is balanced on a knife edge is a staggering understatement in this case. No knife in the universe could have an edge that fine. Now, what do we mean by this? Maybe this will help if I explain it this way. I went to a school in California, a private Christian school called Biola, okay? Actually played basketball at Biola for 4 years. I know what you're thinking, but you're short and you're white. That proves only one thing. There must be a God. My senior year, two of my friends lived in a dorm room called at Biola called Thompson. It was the top of campus, and the cool thing about this dorm is they lived on, I think, the 3rd floor window that overlooked a huge parking lot, a tall row of trees, and then a huge gutter, like that water would go by. And then on the other side, there was a stop sign that cars would pull into as they were coming into campus. Well, my friends and I got what we thought was a good idea. We thought, this is perfect. As cars come in late at night, we will welcome them home with a water balloon to the windshield. So one of my friends went out and got, have you seen those like life-size water balloon launchers that take like 3 people? You know what I'm talking about? Like one person holds it down on this side, the other person holds down this side. It's like a big rubber band, and then you pull it back, you put a water balloon, an egg, a cat in it or something, and you let it fly. So we went to the 3rd floor, and as cars came in, we filled up a bunch of water balloons, and we were just launching them, missing every time. And then we saw this smaller car coming in late, and we thought, this is perfect. So I grabbed one side, my buddy grabbed the other side. One of our friends pulls it back, puts a water balloon in, lets it fly. As this car's pulling up, it crosses the parking lot. It goes above the row of trees. It clears the water gutter. The car stops at the stop sign. Bam, smacks it right on the windshield and cracks it. She has a heart attack. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that bad. That is sick that you laughed at that. That is morbid. She didn't have a heart attack, but needless to say, we had to pay for it. And I was a college student. I didn't have any money. I'm a high school teacher. I still don't have any money. Amen. Thank you. Preach it. Needless to say, our balloon launching days were over. But I want you to think about this for a second. How precisely did we have to get certain parameters to hit our target? What would have happened if we had more water in the water balloon? That's right, it wouldn't have gone as far. What if we had less? It would have gone further. What if there was wind? What if we pulled more this angle? What if we pulled that angle? What if we pulled back further? You see how many things had to be just right to hit our target? We know what we discovered, that the universe is not static. The universe itself is expanding and stretching in every conceivable direction. Yet the weight of the whole universe must be exquisitely set. If it was any different, our whole universe would not support life. So if the mass of the universe was heavier, there'd be too much mass and it would collapse on itself. If the mass was less, the universe would expand so quickly it couldn't form stars, planets capable of supporting life. So Mark Horton, a NASA scientist, put it this way. He said, if the balance between gravity and the expansion rate were altered by 1 part in 1 million billion 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 billion, there would be no galaxies, stars, planets, or life. You know what this number is equivalent to? Just grasp this. This means if the mass of the universe varied the equivalent of all the mass in the entire universe compared to 1 grain of sand, life would be impossible in our whole universe. Do you realize how incredible this is? If there was a grain of sand more or less, our universe could not support life. And yet it's exactly where it needs to be. Now, you know what we discovered? This is only one example. Scientists now tell us there's at least 30 parameters that must be set for the universe to support life. So some of you who like math, if there's any of you who are out there who like math, 3 of you. My wife was a high school math, more, wow. My wife was a high school math teacher. God bless her soul. Some of you are thinking, wait a minute, if that's one example, what happens if we add different examples? We'll take these 2 examples that are coming up right now. What if we take gravity and what's called the cosmological constant? Okay, on the next slide. What if we take 2 of these? Constants in physics. Force of gravity and the cosmological constant. What are the odds that those 2 would be fine-tuned right where they need to be to support life? This is the equivalent of 1 part in 100 million trillion. Now that's a big number. If you can't grasp that number, just think of our new national debt. In fact, do you know what this number is equivalent to? This number is equivalent to 1 atom out of all the mass in the entire universe. You know what happens if we add all of the constants of physics that must be fine-tuned? Roger Penrose from Oxford University says, we couldn't even write down that number in full, since it would require, next slide please, more zeros than the number of elementary particles in the universe. I don't have enough faith to believe that this happened by chance. When I see something fine-tuned, it points towards a fine-tuner. Let's look at a second example in the world of biology, okay? Biochemistry. So we've looked at the macro laws of physics. Let's go down to the micro level. Darwin said something that's very, very important. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. You know what he means by that? He's giving something called a criteria of falsification. Darwin is given a way to show his theory is false. Now, can anybody tell me what would disprove Christianity? What would show that Christianity is definitively false? If we found what? Okay, now's your chance. If we found what? Jesus. If we found the body of Jesus, if I had the femur of Jesus in my bag, number 1, I'd be rich. Number 2, Christianity would be false. Paul says if Jesus has not risen in 1 Corinthians 15, then our faith is in vain. We're following a lie. So you could disprove Christianity by finding the body of Jesus. Well, Darwin did the same thing. He said if you could find any complex system in nature that couldn't have been built in a step-by-step manner, my theory would be false. You see his point? Darwin's theory says at the beginning you have a universal common ancestor, natural selection acting on a random mutation, all of the diversity of life develops. Everything. So if there was something up here that couldn't be built in an incremental process, Darwinism, by Darwin's own definition, would be false. Now, in 1996, a biochemist by the name of Michael B., he wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. And this book has sold over 250,000 copies, which is a lot of copies because it stirred up a debate about our origins. Now, why did he call his book Darwin's Black Box? A black box is something that's interesting, but we have no idea how it works. It's interesting, but I don't have a clue how it functions. My iPad is a black box to me. I know how to push stuff and use it. I don't have a clue how they get it to work. I have no idea it's a black box. In fact, to me, the ultimate black box is women. I've got a mom, 3 sisters. In fact, growing up, 3 sisters, even my cats were female. I didn't know we had a bathroom until I was 16. Darwin's Black Box, why did he call his book that? Because during the time of Darwin, with the technology scientists had, they peered through their microscopes, they looked at the cell, and it looked very simple. So they assumed the cell was simple. But as technology has advanced, now we peer into the cell. We see more technology and sophistication than humans ever dreamed of. So he called it Darwin's Black Box because Darwin didn't know sophistication at the micro level. Now, B, he gave us a concept that's very important. It's called irreducible complexity. This would have been a great thing for you to ask me about yesterday if you were prepared, okay? Here's the definition. An irreducibly complex system is one that requires several closely matched parts in order to function, and where removal of one of the components effectively causes the system to cease functioning. Now, that might sound complex. It's actually really simple. So take, for example, a mousetrap. A mousetrap is irreducibly complex. By the way, why do we need mousetraps? We launched all the cats. Just bringing it full circle for you, all right? Now, a mousetrap is irreducibly complex. Why? It has multiple parts that must all be in the right place at the right time. So if you're missing one of the part of a mousetrap, how well does that mousetrap work? 0. There's at least 5 parts of a mousetrap. There's the wooden base, there's the hammer, there's the catch, there's the hold, and then there's the bar that goes across it. If you're missing one of those parts, it doesn't work 80% or 50%, it works none. You see, a mousetrap is either all or it's none. Now, why would a mousetrap pose a problem for Darwin's theory? Because remember, Darwin's theory says things are built in a step-by-step manner. But any simpler system than a mousetrap would be lacking a part, so what would happen to it? Natural selection would weed it out instead of preserve it. So you can't build a mousetrap in a step-by-step manner, at least in a Darwinian fashion. You also can't, in Darwinism, have it just bam, all show up because it's far too complex and improbable. So mousetrap fits Michael Behe's description of irreducibly complex and shows that Darwinism would be false. But of course, mousetraps are man-made. So the question is there anything like a mousetrap in nature? Well, look at something called the bacterial flagellum. Maybe some of you have heard this before. This to me is unbelievable. You know what this is? This is a whip-like tail on the back of certain bacteria. Go ahead to the next slide here for me. It's a whip-like tail on the back of bacteria, and it propels it through water. This thing is 1/100,000th of an inch. 1/100,000th of an inch. You know this thing spins with RPMs at 100,000 RPMs? To give you a little context, the Honda S2000 sports car has 9,000 RPMs. This thing has 100,000 RPMs. It can go full speed and then within a quarter turn stop and go full speed the other direction. This is why Howard Berg from Harvard University called it the most efficient motor in the universe. There's no motor that compares to this tiny little flagellum on the back of certain bacteria. But you know what the problem is for evolution? Is this motor is just like a mousetrap. There's at least 40 unique proteins that must be present for the flagellum to work. If one of them or an equivalent is missing, guess what happens to the whole flagellum? It doesn't work at all. So any simpler system has no function and doesn't work, so it couldn't be built in a step-by-step manner, and also couldn't just show up because it's too complex. It's irreducibly complex. Now, if you read the popular literature on this, people will say things like, oh, those idiot creationists believe this is a good argument. It's been disproved for years. But if you read the technical literature like professional journals, you know what they say? They say, well, we can't really explain it, but we're working on it. So, for example, David Depew from Iowa, he wrote this. Iowa State University, a public school, he said, quote, throw up the slide there for me. He says, I cannot agree more with the claim that contemporary Darwinism lacks the models that explain the evolution of cellular pathways and the problem of the origin of life. And I think he's exactly right. So what have we seen some more? We'll look at the last one, then we'll take some questions. On the level of physics, the universe is fine-tuned exquisitely, which points towards a fine-tuner or an intelligent agent. On the level of the micro, we see this little engineering capabilities that points towards an engineer. Let's look at the last one, which is my personal favorite in the world of biology. How many of you have taken a biology class? Let me see your hands so I know. Okay, almost all of you have. Now, despite what you've maybe been told, biology is not just the study of living systems. It's not. Do you know biology is the study, according to Nobel laureate David Baltimore, it's the science of information. biology studies information. Since the discovery of DNA in 1953, scientists learned that the human body is composed of information. In fact, your whole body is like a big memory stick, which is why the DNA on your body, anyone from your hair, from your skin, from your bones, has all the information, in a sense, for you. Now, here's the question. How much information is there in the human body? Now, I want everybody to just literally stop what you're doing and focus on this. Let me see everybody's eyes. This is a teacher moment. Just grasp this for a second. The average adult human body has 100 trillion cells. 100 trillion cells in your body. If you took the DNA out of one cell and uncoiled it in length, do you know it would be 9 feet in length? That means if we took all the DNA in your body and lined it up together, you know how far it would go? It would go from here to the sun and back about 70 times. That's crazy, isn't it? That's just the DNA in your body. Well, what does DNA do? It stores information. How much information? Well, one of the 100 trillion cells in your body has the equivalent of 8 billion letters, 500 million words, or 8,000 books. In fact, check this out. A study I just recently saw said the DNA in one cell in your body has the equivalent of 500,000 DVDs. Would you like a memory stick that can store 500,000 DVDs? Some of you would still get bored. Do you realize how complex the cell is inside the human body? This is why Bill Gates, the creator of Microsoft, said, DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. And yes, that's also true for Apple. So this raises a very thorny problem for those who do not believe in intelligent design. Where did this information come from? What process can explain why a cell in your body has so much information? Well, those who do not believe in intelligent design have an explanation, and it reminds me of one of my favorite comedies. Take a look at this clip that explains the attempt some people have to account for information apart from design.
I want to ask you a question straight out, flat out. I want you to give me the honest answer. What do you think the chances are of a guy like you and a girl like me ending up together?
Well, Lloyd, that's difficult to say. We really don't...
Hit me with it. Just give it to me straight. I came a long way just to see you married. Just least you can do is level with me. What are my chances?
Not good.
You mean not good like 1 out of 100?
I'd say more like 1 out of 1,000,000.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
I love that clip. The obvious humor when she says 1 out of 1,000,000 is that he doesn't have what? He doesn't have a chance. Listen, in the most widely read atheistic book of our day called The God Delusion, atheist Richard Dawkins, in trying to explain the origin of information in the cell, he says, chance, we just got lucky. In fact, he came up with the idea called the monkeys typing Shakespeare theorem. Richard Dawkins said, if you have enough monkeys and you have enough computers or typewriters and you sit them down and give them enough time, eventually one of these monkeys will type out all the works of Shakespeare. Do you see what he's trying to do? He's trying to have a blind process result in information. Well, the question is this possible? Could a monkey sit down and type out Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet and Midsummer's Night Dream? Is that going to happen? Well, there's actually a scientist by the name of Seth Lloyd. He's a quantum computational physicist from MIT. And he wanted to mathematically calculate how much information could arise, given the age and size of our entire universe, how much information could arise by chance. And you know what he concluded? Not all the works of Shakespeare, not one work of Shakespeare, not one chapter of one work of Shakespeare, not one page, not a paragraph. All the resources in our universe by chance could only produce 4 lines from the works of Shakespeare. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer. So a few years ago, some students and a professor got together and decided to test the monkeys typing Shakespeare theorem. So they actually put some monkeys in the Paignton Zoo and gave them a computer and gave them a typewriter to see if they'd sit down and start typing out Romeo and Juliet. The first monkey picked up a rock and tried to bash the computer. Another monkey climbed up on top and urinated and defecated on the computer. But before you laughed and mocked them, do you know in the weeks they were in there, these monkeys produced almost 6 to 7 pages of written text. That's right. These monkeys wrote 6 pages of text. You know what it was? A string of A's, L's, M's, an occasional J, and a few S's. Not a single word. Now, in case you haven't bought any CDs in the back or books and you need some written material before school starts, you can actually purchase the literary works of these monkeys. They've been put into a volume called Notes Towards the Complete Works of Shakespeare. Throw the picture up there for me. I'm actually not kidding about this. You can buy this online, what they typed out, if you want to spend your money on it. Not gonna happen. Now, I think the reason some of you are chuckling is because you know something that's very obvious, don't you? You know that if you came and visit me and we're walking on Capitol Beach and you see something that says, John loves Mary. By the way, since we've been hanging out for these couple days, if you guys are ever in Southern California, I live in a place called San Juan Capistrano, 10 minutes from the beach, especially when you're in college. If you need a warm cooked meal, you need a place to stay, somewhere to do laundry, let me know, and I'll pray for you. So say you come visit me in Southern California, and we go walking on Capitol Beach near where I live, and you see etched in the sand, it says, John loves Mary. I doubt any of you would stop and say, that's crazy. I've heard about earthquakes in Southern California, but I had no idea when the ground shook, messages just rose to the surface. None of you would say, gosh, they have crazy erosion and waves and tides in California that leaves messages. If you saw that, you'd know for sure the only possible explanation is that someone wrote it. You'd know that either John does love Mary, or maybe Mary wants to be loved by John, or maybe someone's playing a trick on both of them. But you know for sure that when you see information, the only possible explanation is that a person with a mind did it. Well, look, when we look outside in nature and in the cell, we don't see the equivalent of John loves Mary. We see vast amounts of information. You see, Stephen Meyer from Cambridge, he's a philosopher of science. He wrote this. He wrote, quote, let me read it for you. He said, whenever we find information and we know the causal story of how that information arose, we always find that it arose from an intelligent source. So for example, if you pick up a book and you see information, you trace it back to an author. If you look on your shirt says accelerate, you trace that back, you find a person who wrote it. You pick up a newspaper, you trace it back to a journalist. If you don't know what a newspaper is, just ask your youth leader. If you get a text and it's legible, you trace it back to a texter. If we walk outside and in the sky the clouds say drink Coke, I doubt any of you'd say, oh yeah, that happens here in Texas when a storm's coming from the east. You would know that a pilot or a mind went through and wrote that. Well, when we look inside the human cell in DNA, we don't see the equivalent of drink Coke or something like John loves Mary. We see more information and storage capacity in a manner that's far more complex than anything humans can even come close to creating. I don't have enough faith to believe that that could happen by chance. Just as the fine-tuning of the universe points towards a fine-tuner, the engineering of the bacterial flagellum points towards an engineer, the information in the cell points towards an information giver or an author. And I'm not the only one who's saying this, by the way. About 10 years ago, there was an announcement, maybe some of you remember it, that shocked the world. Maybe some of you youth leaders remember when an atheist by the name of Antony Flew, who for 50 years, for 5 decades, was the most widely read atheist in the world. He first presented a paper called Theology and Falsification at Oxford at the Socratic Club before C.S. Lewis, arguing that belief in God is meaningless. He died a year or two ago, yet in 2007, he released a book called There Is a God, Why the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And you know what changed his mind? Remember I said as an atheist, the more we learn about science, the smaller the gaps become? He said the reality is the opposite. The more science progressed, the greater the gaps become, and the more there were the fingerprints of a designer. And he actually wrote this. He said, quote, "What I think the DNA material has done is show that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements together. The enormous complexity by which these results were achieved looks to me like the work of intelligence." And I think he's right. You know what? I grew up in a Christian home. And in fact, my father spent his life defending Christianity, writing books saying Christianity is true, debating, speaking, traveling around the world. And I was about 19 years old. I had a point where I had serious questions about my faith. I remember thinking, man, what if I grew up in a different culture? Why would God send somebody to hell? How do I really know the Bible's true? And these questions bothered me. I remember staying up at night, like staring up, thinking, God, I can't hear you. Are you even present? And I remember reading an atheist who now I actually know, interestingly enough. And he wrote this. He said, if God exists, why doesn't he make himself more obvious? He said, in fact, why doesn't God write on the moon, Jesus lives? Why doesn't he write with the stars, Christianity's true? Or why doesn't he write on every cell made by Yahweh? After all our toys say, made in China, right? Why doesn't God do this? And it bothered me. And then I started to study the scientific evidence for God, in particular DNA, and you know what I discovered? That he did. With DNA, it's as if the creator of the universe autographed every single cell in the human body. If you have eyes to see and ears to hear, God has made himself known. You are not a cosmic accident. You are not a mistake. Every single one of you in here, regardless of your gender, your age, your skin color, you have been made in the image of a God who loves you and who has a plan for your life. And you know what? People often ask me, after I've given this presentation, people say, man, the evidence is unbelievable. Will there ever be so much evidence where people are forced to believe and have to admit there's a God? And I say, no, of course not. If you don't want to believe, there's always a way out. Let me tell you one story, then we'll take questions. I had a friend who called me on the phone one time, and it's the kind of call that made me about fall over and faint. Why? Here's a guy who graduated from high school with perfect SAT scores in math. Really, really smart. He was in one of the top universities in the country. And I talked to him for years about Christianity and God, and there was just no interest on his part. And then all of a sudden I got a phone call. He said, hey, Sean, you teach your students how to know Christianity is true, right? I said, yes. He looked at me, he said, where do we start? I about fell over. I said, wait a minute, we've been talking about this for years. Why are you asking me now? And you know what he said? At that time, his brother was 15. How many of you are 15 here? Let me see your hands. Look around. His brother was 15, and you know what he had? He had a brain tumor that was cancerous. And on the phone, he said, this has woken me up to my own mortality. I need to know if there's a God. We went to Starbucks and sat there about an hour and a half. I sat down, he looked me in the eyes, he said, I'm scientific minded. Can you give me any scientific proof that God exists? We walked through all of it. He asked me questions about the Bible, about Jesus, about why God allows evil. At the end, he looked at me, I said, I think I believe that Jesus is God, but I need more time to think about it. Fast forward about 5 or 6 years. He's still thinking about it. Last I talked to him, I said, you told me you think Jesus is God. How come you don't believe? He said 2 reasons. Number 1, I don't like Fox News. Now, you probably don't watch Fox News, but he was under the impression that if you're a Christian, you had to hold certain political views in a certain way. I said, let's talk about Jesus. We'll get to politics later. And then he said, I'm not sure what my friends will think. And instantly, I knew exactly what it was. It had nothing to do with whether it was true or not, but everything to do with whether he wanted to change his life to follow the truth. Friends, there is a truth. God loves you. Every single one of you have been made in the image of God. It's written in the stars in the sky and the fine tuning, and it's written on every cell in your body. And that God has revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ. The question is, will you follow this God who is the only one who can truly set you free? Amen? We're going to take some questions for just a minute related to this subject or anything that came up last night. Questions, if our mic will move around fast. I saw this hand fly up. And if you'll ask your questions quickly, there goes my top of this. That would be awkward if this went. That'd be really awkward. Yes?
I have a question about last night.
Okay. Shh, hold it really close.
You were talking about how you're an atheist and everything. Yeah. Well, if you were an atheist, what would you do when you died? Would you have a spirit?
This is a good question. As an atheist, when I role played, atheists do not believe in the soul. So what we mean by the soul is your non-physical self that can survive the death of your body. So what you and I believe is when our body stops functioning, our brain stops sending signals, our heart stops beating, your center of consciousness, your thinking self, will survive and continue and be with God in heaven, and then eventually you'll get a resurrected physical body. Well, atheists do not believe in the existence of the soul. So when the body stops functioning, they believe death is permanent, it's eternal, and it's fixed. There's no surviving death, period. That's what an atheist would believe. So when death hits, it's over forever. You want to know one reason I believe in the soul? I have a lot of reasons, but I'll tell you something really, really interesting. I don't know that I believe in all those books like 90 Minutes Heaven, 3 Minutes Hell, and Heaven is Real. I don't know that I buy those, but I'll tell you some things I do believe in. In my book is God Just a Human Invention that some of you got yesterday. There was a woman by the name of Pamela. And you know what they found about her? She was diagnosed with a rare brain condition, an aneurysm in the brain. She went to the surgeons and they said, you have, I think it was a few months to live and then you'll be dead. They said, but we have this really cutting edge, potentially dangerous procedure we'd be willing to try if you want to. It's called cardiac arrest. You know what they do? And she said, I'll try it, otherwise I'm gonna die. They take her brain and they lower the temperature down. They put earmuffs on her so she can hear nothing, blindfold her. And then what they would do is they would open up the brain, drain the blood out of it, go inside, snip where the aneurysm is, fill the brain back up, and then warm it up, and hopefully she would survive. It's called they call it a cardiac arrest. Well, she did this procedure, they got rid of the aneurysm, she came back. And then she starts describing what happened in the room while she had no brain waves whatsoever. She said, yes, my soul left my body and I could look down. Here's the bone saw that you used. Here's the conversation you had. She gives all these details. There's no possible way she could have known. Why did this happen? They've documented it. Because when your body stops functioning, your soul continues to live after it. I document a story in that book about a kid who gets in an accident, is rushed to the hospital, and he said, yes, my soul left my body, and I saw a red shoe up on the top of the hospital building on a corner. Kid comes back to health, they go up there and they find the shoe. I mean, there are documented cases like this in near-death journals that tells me when the body stops functioning, the soul continues. An atheist would have to give some explanation for that and say, well, it's luck, it's coincidence, and they would have to try to explain it away. Okay, but I don't buy it. I think there is a soul. Excellent question. Other ones from this morning or last night? Is there a hand back there very quickly? One more question. Okay, all right. One more question we have time for.
Yesterday you were talking about whenever you were doing the atheist act, that God gives us free will, but whenever it comes to dangerous situations and everything, he doesn't intervene all the time and keep us safe. Can you just expound on that topic a little bit?
When it came to evil?
Yes.
Here's what I said. I said if God is all-powerful, he could create a world without evil. Very, very important. Yes, God could create a world without evil, but even God cannot create a world in which we have genuinely free choices, and then God determines what those choices will be. Just like God cannot make a married bachelor, he can't. God cannot make a square circle. Why? Because those things are illogical and they can't be done. When we say God is all-powerful, we don't mean God can do anything. We mean God can do anything consistent with his holy nature that is logically possible. Well, a square circle is impossible in itself. For God to create free beings and then determine that we always do good, we wouldn't really be free, would we? So you guys were hitting on this yesterday, and I think you were right, but as an atheist, I couldn't concede it, that God thought it was worth it to have a world in which love and courage are possible. But as soon as you create a world in which people can love, what can happen? People can choose not to love. People can choose to hate. So we do know that God has stepped in sometimes and stopped evil and judged. And we know when it's all said and done, God will step in and he will right every wrong and he will judge evil. But in the meantime, God has given us some free choice to act on what we think is true because God deemed it worthwhile that we have the possibility of loving each other and loving him for eternity. And frankly, I think you and I know that free will is worth it. Our world would lose something if there was not free will and we didn't actually have choice. And I think God felt it was worth it. Hey, very quickly, we ran out yesterday of 2 of the books. They were going quickly. What I talked about this morning, Understand, Intelligent Design, again, it's marked down to $10, usually 14 or 15. There's a handful of those left, and I've still got about a half a box of the Apologetic Study Bibles, where all the questions, every single one we went into yesterday, some of what we talked about this morning are answered briefly. I opened it up, it said, is alcohol bad? That's an interesting question. Why does God seem hidden? That's a good question. Tactics, here's one. Remember we said if God exists, God needs a cause? It says if everything that exists needs a cause, then God needs a cause. How do you answer that? All the questions I threw at you are in here and really, really helpful. Again, discounted down. Take advantage of that. Some of you have grabbed me at lunch and walking around and asked questions. That's great. I'm here to help you and I'm here to serve if we can, all right? You guys rock. Have a good afternoon.